All right, y'all, we're back to finish out chapter 9, and we're starting right here on the third and a half paragraph where it says canoe travel. Canoe travel had become impossibly slow. The Jefferson River was more like a shallow stream than a river. There were frustrating delays when the canoes got stuck on the boulders or tree roots. Seamen splashed along the icy shallow water as the men strained against the ropes. The group came to the mouth of another stream, and Clark wasn't sure which waterway was the Jefferson River, although they kept expecting to see Lewis or one of his scouts return with some news. Days passed with no words. On August 17th, the men were dragging the canoes when Seaman barked and took off at a gallop. A few minutes later, he returned with one of Lewis's scouts and an Indian brave. The Indian was so thin his ribs stuck out. He wore a cloth around his waist, a baggy vest, and a brightly colored cloth headband. Clark waved. He turned to Sacagawea and asked, "Is this brave one of your people?" Sacagawea smiled and nodded. "He wears the clothing of my people." "Captain Clark," called the scout, "Captain Lewis is in the camp with the Shoshone chief. We saw the Indians' horse herd. They have about 400 animals." Clark told the explorers to beach the boats. He ordered some men to guard the supplies and told the others to follow him. Taking Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Seaman, he hurried ahead as they rounded the bend. Seaman dashed up the bank, barking happily. In a minute, Clark saw Lewis waving to him, his face beaming. Seaman bounded to Lewis, wagging his tail. Lewis threw his arms around Seaman, letting a dog cover his face with wet kisses. He buried his hands in Seaman's warm fur and gave a silent prayer of thanks. At last the corpse of Discovery was together again. They had finally located the Shoshones, and the Indians had plenty of horses to trade. The Indians crowded around, eager to look at the newcomers. Clark ran up to Lewis and held him by his shoulders. "Meriwether, you did it! You found the Shoshones!" "I am so glad to see you, William. We've been camped here for days, waiting." Lewis's words rushed out. "When you didn't come, the Indians started grumbling. They thought I was playing some sort of trick on them. I was afraid that they would leave before you arrived with the trade goods." Lewis stroked Seaman's head and told him to sit. "Stay, Seaman." Seaman responded immediately. He sat, his eyes searching Lewis's face. He did not move a muscle except the tip of his tail, which wagged back and forth. Then Lewis led Clark to the Shoshone chief, Camelwat. It does not have pronunciation. Camelwat. The chief grasped Clark and gave him a full-body hug, a traditional greeting from among the Shoshone men. Camelwat decorated Clark's hair with shells to honor him. The Indians gathered around to watch, smiling at the explorers. These men were the first people the Shoshones had ever seen who were not Indians. The greetings began, and the explorers found themselves smothered with hugs. Several of the Shoshones marveled at Seaman. They made a sign for a bear and seemed astonished that the big dog would sit so patiently. The Indians said that the dog's intelligence was astonishing. The Indians also seemed amazed that the man could have black skin. They eagerly touched the bare skin on York's neck and arms, and then they hugged him. Suddenly a woman screamed. Everyone froze, startled. Seaman woofed and sprang to his feet. His eyes scanned the people's faces, searching for danger. One of the Shoshone women clutched Sacagawea and both began to cry. The women recognized each other. They had been childhood friends. The two were in the same camping party when the Hadasta raiders took Sacagawea prisoner. In fact, the women had acquired her name, Lumping Fish, from the way that she leaped across the stream to escape from the Hadasats. The explorers watched astonished as quiet, calm Sacagawea screamed and danced around, weeping with joy. The two young women hugged, tears streaming down their cheeks. Then they laughed through their tears, grasping each other's shoulders to gaze in wonder into each other's faces. Words tumbled from their mouths. After a few minutes, the women quieted down. Sacagawea slid Pomp off her back and showed him to her friend. Lumping Fish held the baby in her arms and drenched him with teary kisses. Late that afternoon, after the greetings were finished, the captains held a meeting with the Camelwat. with Camelot and some of his braves. Sacagawea was a translator, and Seaman sat calmly by her side. The men were deep in their talk when Sacagawea suddenly stopped translating. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Camelot. Puzzled, the captain stared at her. Ignoring the awkward silence, Sacagawea called out a few words in Shoshone. She jumped up and ran to Chief Camelot. Then she threw her arms around him and held him. Lewis looked at Charbonneau. "What's going on?" he asked. "Sacagawea just recognized her brother." Astounded, the men stared. Sacagawea called the Shoshone chief by his childhood name. Camelot smoothed his sister's hair, looked into his eyes, and tenderly held her slender face in his large, weathered hands. Sacagawea unwound the blanket, tied around her waist, and threw it over their heads so that she could weep with Camelot in private. Sobs shook her body as she held her brother, a grown man, and the leader of the people that she had been torn apart from as a girl. After a while, Sacagawea returned quietly to her seat in the circle. Seaman crept to her side, and she laid hand on the dog's broad back as if to steady herself. The men resumed their talk, and Sacagawea translated. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and several times her face crumbled. She had to pause to hold her hand in front of her eyes, struggling to compose herself. Finally, she nodded at the captains, and the meeting continued. Camelot remained calm, as befitted the leader of his people.
Befitted.
It's got the ed on the end. To be suitable to or proper for. Camelot remained calm and proper as the leader of his people. But his eyes looked lovingly on this young woman who had been a little girl last they called each other brother and sister. The Shoshone Indians helped the explorers carry their baggage over the first high pass in the Rockies. Seaman ran along aside the Indians and the explorers of the steep trail, wearing his saddlebags packed full of goods. Food was scarce, but the two groups shared what little they had. By August 26th, the work was complete. That night, the explorers held a party in camp to thank the Indians. Cuzat played his fiddle, and the men danced. York danced a jig, and the Indians called out their appreciation for his nimble feet. It was a merry evening, but the leaders of the group were both nervous. Early that morning there had been a frost. The Shoshones were eager to reach the buffalo hunting grounds of the plains to lay a store of meat for the winter. Without this food supply, their band would starve in the coming months. The explorers had to get enough horses to carry them across the mountains before the snow came, or their group would also starve to death. Over the next few days, horses trading occupied most of the leaders' time. Seaman sat near the captains as they haggled for horses. At first, bargaining was easy. The Indians were delighted to trade with such common items as a horse for novelties like cloth, shirts, or mirrors. But as soon as the Indians realized the explorers were desperate to acquire horses and would pay whatever they could, in just a few days the price of the Shoshone horses greatly increased. The explorers bargained away some of their dearest possessions, knives, guns, and ammunition. In the end, they got their horses, 29 of them, and the animals did not come cheaply. But it was not the Shoshone custom to travel west toward the Pacific Ocean. It was not the Shoshone custom to travel west toward the Pacific Ocean, but one older man in their band, old Toby, had made his journey years ago. He knew the way through the mountains, and he agreed to guide the expedition. Both Indians and the explorers were keenly aware that the winter was closing in. It was crucial to be on their separate ways. For Sacagawea, this was a painful thought. She had been torn away by her family and friends and the homeland where she was a girl of 12. For so many years, she held no hope of seeing any of her people again. Miraculously, in the last 2 weeks, she had been reunited with both her brother and her childhood friend. But she was a young mother herself now, with her own husband and family. She had a job to do for the Corps of Discovery. Together with Charbonneau and the explorers, she turned toward the west and the unknown lands leading to the Pacific Ocean. How she yearned for her heart to be turning east with the people of her birth. Sacagawea said her farewells to her people. As always, she accepted her future without complaint. as a stream accepts melting snow in the spring and a cooling rain in the autumn. Seaman stayed close to the horse, and Sacagawea rode as the explorers waved goodbye to the Shoshone. He sensed that this trail was steeper for the young Indian woman than for the other explorers.